The world of the 3rd century was a fractured mosaic of iron and blood, where the shadow of Rome stretched long and cold across the pagan wildlands. In the rugged terrains of Canaan, a child was born not of mere flesh, but seemingly of the ancient earth itself. They called him Reprobus, a name that tasted of the outcast and the unrefined. Even in his first breaths, the air around him seemed to thicken with a heavy, destined silence. The midwives whispered of the stars aligning over the jagged peaks, sensing that this babe would not walk the path of common men. He was a creature of vast proportions, a titan cradled in a world of mortals. His mother, a woman of weathered grace, looked upon her son with a mixture of awe and a biting prophetic fear. She saw in his oversized limbs a strength that could either steady the pillars of the earth or crumble them into dust. His cries were not whimpers, but low, resonant echoes of a coming storm. As the years bled into one another, Reprobus grew with a frightening velocity, his shadow looming over the village like a nomadic mountain. By his 12th winter, he stood head and shoulders above the strongest warriors, his skin toughened by the sun, his eyes searching the horizon for a purpose. The elders spoke in hushed tones of the Cynocephali, the dog-headed giants of legend, projecting their superstitions onto his massive frame. He moved with a heavy grace, a silent sentinel of the wilderness, possessing a heart that beat with the rhythm of a drum, calling for a master he had yet to meet. But what is a mountain without a sky to reach for, or a tide without a moon to pull it? Reprobus felt a void within his colossal chest, a hollow space that no amount of physical conquest or earthly praise could fill. He was a weapon forged in the heavens, waiting for a hand to wield him. The air in Canaan grew thin with the tension of his untapped potential, as if the very soil was gasping under his weight. He did not seek the simple life of the plow or the hearth. He sought the ultimate sovereignty. He would serve only the greatest king that ever reigned under the sun. Thus, the giant turned his back on the familiar dust of his birthplace, his footsteps shaking the road as he began his trek toward the citadels of power. Little did he know that the king he sought did not sit upon a throne of gold, nor did he command legions of steel. Who is the master of a man who fears nothing? The 3rd century was a fractured mirror, reflecting a world drowning in the crimson tides of chaos. The Roman Empire, once a monolith of order, now groaned under the weight of decaying marble, and the relentless march of barbarian hordes at its crumbling, soot-stained borders. Iron-fisted usurpers rose and fell like shadows in a flickering torchlight, each claiming a throne that sat upon a foundation of betrayal. In the marketplaces, the air was thick with the scent of cheap wine, sweat, and the underlying metallic tang of constant, looming execution. Faith was a desperate gamble in these darkening times, a frantic plea whispered to stone idols that offered no solace to the weary. The old gods of Olympus were fading, replaced by the cold, calculated worship of the emperor, a man-god who demanded blood as the only true currency. Into this arena of vanity and violence stepped the giant Reprobus, his massive feet stirring the dust of ancient highways. He watched the legions march with their eagles held high, their armor clanking in a rhythmic symphony of oppression. He sought the source of this absolute, earthly power. The cities he passed were labyrinths of greed, where the wealthy feasted on the labor of the broken. To Reprobus, the grandeur of Rome seemed like a gilded cage, a magnificent structure built to house the shifting whims of men who feared the coming of the night. He observed the local kings, men who draped themselves in purple silk and spoke of eternal legacies. Yet, beneath their bravado, he glimpsed the flickering shadows of insecurity in their eyes. They clutched their scepters with trembling hands, terrified of the very shadows that danced on their palace walls. Reprobus sought a sovereign whose authority was not a mere garment to be stripped away by a sharper blade. He craved a master of the spirit, one whose command over the physical realm was but a fraction of a deeper, more terrifyingly beautiful, an absolute cosmic dominion. As he approached the court of a renowned ruler, the giant's heart beat with a singular, driving question. Is this king truly the master of all he surveys? Or does he too bow his head to a force that lingers unseen in the dark? The search for ultimate power had begun. The memory of his youth was a landscape of jagged peaks and silent valleys, where Reprobus first realized he was a stranger to the smallness of men. While other children played in the dirt, he stared at the sun, unblinking, feeling a strange kinship with the celestial fire. His strength was not a gift he understood, but a burden that isolated him from the warmth of the hearth. One evening, he accidentally crushed a heavy stone bowl between his palms, watching the ceramics shatter like dried leaves. His mother's silent, wide-eyed gasp remained etched in his soul. There were moments in the deep woods when the wind seemed to speak his name in a language older than the mountains. He would sit by the roaring rapids, watching the salmon struggle against the current, and feel a phantom weight pressing down upon his broad, youthful shoulders. Once, during a fierce summer storm that leveled the village wheat fields, the young giant stood alone on a hill. While others hid in terror, he raised his massive arms toward the lightning, laughing as if the thunder were a long-lost brother calling him home to the sky. A traveling mystic had once passed through Canaan, stopping his donkey to gaze upon the boy with eyes that saw through time. The old man did not offer a blessing, but a warning whispered into the dust. Greatest of frames shall carry the heaviest of treasures across the waters. These words haunted his dreams, manifesting as visions of a vast, turbulent river that flowed with the blood of stars. He saw himself standing in the center of the flood, his knees buckling under a burden that was invisible, yet more massive than the entire world of men. Despite his growing lethality as a hunter, Reprobus refused to take joy in the kill or the conquest. He was a creature designed for service, not for slaughter, possessing a latent gentleness that confused the warriors who tried to recruit him into their petty local tribal wars. By the time he reached the full stature of a man, the signs were undeniable. He was a vessel waiting to be filled. The giant looked at his hands, capable of tearing oak trees from the earth, and knew they were meant for a singular, divine, and world-shaking purpose. Reprobus sought the throne of a king whose name was whispered with trembling reverence across the southern lands. This monarch was a weaver of iron laws, a conqueror who had never tasted the bitterness of defeat. To the giant, he seemed the pinnacle of earthly and sovereign might. He stood before the high dais, his head nearly brushing the vaulted rafters of the palace. The king, dwarfed by the Titan's presence, accepted his service with a smile of predatory triumph. Here, Reprobus thought, was a master worthy of his strength, a man who commanded life and death. For months, the giant marched at the king's side, a living wall of muscle that silenced all dissent. He watched as cities opened their gates in terror at his approach. Yet, the emptiness in his heart remained, a silent hunger that the glory of battle could not satisfy. The revelation came during a lavish banquet, where a minstrel sang a dark ballad of the devil's cunning. As the name of the fallen prince was uttered, the king's face paled. With a trembling hand, the monarch traced the sign of the cross upon his brow, his eyes flickering. Reprobus watched this subtle gesture with a mounting, cold fury. He realized that the man he served, the supposed master of the world, was himself a servant of fear. The king's power was a hollow shell, shielding a soul that cowered before a name whispered in a song. "Why do you tremble at a shadow?" the giant demanded, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. The king's answer was a stuttering admission of weakness. He confessed that the devil was a greater power, a dark lord against whom his own earthly legions were utterly and hopelessly futile. Without a word of farewell, Reprobus turned his back on the throne of gold and the trembling king. He would not waste his titanic strength on a master who bowed to another. If the devil was the source of such profound terror, then the devil would be his master. He strode out of the palace gates and into the gathering gloom of the wilderness, seeking the Prince of Darkness. The trial of his youth had stripped away the illusion of human royalty, leaving him on a path toward a darker, more ancient, and far more sinister throne of power. The giant ventured into the desolate wastes, where the sun scorched the earth and the wind howled like a wounded beast. He sought no civilization, but the raw, unbridled power of the darkness. In the heart of a jagged canyon, he encountered a band of lawless and brutal men. Their leader sat upon a throne of bleached bones, his eyes burning with a cruel, flickering fire. He claimed to be the Prince of Darkness himself, the master of all shadows and the architect of human misery. Reprobus stood before him, ready to pledge his immense, terrifying strength. The atmosphere grew cold and oppressive, as if the very air was thick with the weight of unspoken sins. For a time, the giant served this dark lord, crushing any who dared to cross their path. He believed he had finally found the ultimate pinnacle of earthly and spiritual power. One afternoon, while riding along a dusty and deserted trade route, the band of thieves came upon a simple wooden cross. It stood humble and solitary against the vast, azure sky. Upon seeing it, the leader's horse reared back, and his face twisted into a mask of pure terror. The man who called himself the devil veered his mount sharply, fleeing into the scrubland to avoid the shadow of the cross. Reprobus watched in stunned silence as his master, who had boasted of conquering empires, now trembled like a leaf in a gale before two pieces of wood. What power resides in that humble sign to strike such fear into your heart? The giant thundered, his voice echoing through the canyon. The leader, his voice shaking with a primal dread, confessed that he feared the one who had died upon that cross, the King of all kings. The great shaking had begun within the giant's soul. The foundations of his world crumbled as he realized that even the Prince of Darkness was but a fugitive before a higher, unseen authority. The dark throne was a lie, a mere shadow cast by a far greater, divine light. Reprobus abandoned the thieves in that desolate place, his heart burning with a new and desperate hunger. He would no longer serve the shadows or the men who feared them. He would find this King of Kings, whose very symbol could send the darkness screaming into the abyss. The giant wandered through the wilderness with a hollow chest, his footsteps heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The sun rose and set over a dozen horizons before he stumbled upon a secluded grotto, where a humble hermit lived in the silence of prayer and deep, holy contemplation. This man of God did not tremble at the giant's shadow, nor did he marvel at his titanic frame. Instead, the hermit looked into the eyes of Reprobus and saw a soul that was larger than the body, a spirit starving for a truth that no earthly king could provide. "Who is this King of Kings whose sign scatters the darkness?" Reprobus asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cave. The hermit spoke of Christ, the sovereign of the heavens, who conquered death not with a sword of iron, but with the boundless power of a sacrificial and divine love. The hermit instructed the giant that to serve this king, he must dedicate his life to fasting and long hours of vigil. But Reprobus, whose massive body required vast sustenance to maintain its strength, shook his head in honest despair, fearing he would perish before he could truly serve. "Then find another way to please him," the hermit replied, his eyes twinkling with a sudden, inspired wisdom. He led the giant to the edge of a ferocious, churning river, where the currents were violent and the waters ran deep enough to swallow even the strongest of horses. Many travelers had been lost to these treacherous depths, their cries silenced by the cold, indifferent roar of the flood. The hermit told the giant that his strength was a gift meant to preserve life, and by carrying the weak across, he would be serving the Lord of life. Reprobus looked at the swirling water, a mirror of the turbulence within his own heart. He realized that his purpose was not to conquer with his hands, but to support with his back. He built a small hut of mud and branches on the muddy, reeds-choked bank. The divine call had finally found its vessel in the most unlikely of places. No longer a seeker of thrones, the giant became a servant of the crossing. He waited by the river, a living bridge of flesh and bone, ready to face the waters for the sake of the king. The riverbank became a sanctuary of solitude, a place where the giant's only companions were the rhythmic lapping of the tides and the cold, indifferent star. In this desolate exile, the silence was louder than the roar of the rapids, forcing him to face the ghost of his own pride. He was a man built for the thunder of battle, yet now his days were measured by the slow passage of travelers and the gathering of wood. The hunger in his belly was a constant predator, a physical reminder of the comforts he had abandoned to follow a king he could not see. The dampness of the river air seeped into his massive bones, and the isolation began to gnaw at his resolve like a persistent flood. He often looked at his calloused hands, wondering if a creature of such vast, violent power was truly meant to wither away in this muddy, forgotten corner. Nightly, the shadows of his past arrogance returned to haunt his meager hut, whispering that he was wasting his vitality on the weak and the poor. He fought the urge to leave the river behind and return to the service of kings who offered gold, silk, and a warrior's glory. In the depths of this internal war, Reprobus learned that true strength was not the ability to destroy, but the discipline to endure. He spent long hours in the biting cold, carving a massive staff from a fallen tree, a physical anchor for his spirit as much as for his body. The roar of the waters began to sound like a prayer, a chaotic hymn that mirrored the struggle within his breast. Every traveler he lifted onto his broad shoulders was a victory over his own ego, a small sacrifice offered to the mysterious king who valued the lowliest of servants. His vanity slowly dissolved in the silt of the river, replaced by a rugged, stoic patience that even the fiercest storms could not shake. He became a part of the landscape, a rooted oak of a man who found purpose in the simple, grueling labor of being a living, breathing bridge. The transformation was subtle but profound, as the giant's heart began to beat in unison with the divine rhythm of the earth. He no longer sought the pinnacle of a mountain. He was content in the depths of the valley, waiting for the one moment that would define his eternal soul. The sky collapsed into a bruised purple as a tempest of biblical proportions descended upon the valley. Thunder shook the very foundations of the earth, and the river transformed into a churning, blackened abyss of murderous intent. In his humble hut, the giant listened to the wind's predatory howl. Through the veil of driving rain, a thin, ethereal voice pierced the chaos, calling out to him from the muddy bank. Reprobus stepped into the storm, his massive staff clutched in a white-knuckled grip. There, shivering in the gloom, stood a small, solitary child, with eyes like distant, shimmering stars. The boy asked to be carried across the raging torrent, his voice calm despite the lightning that fractured the heavens above. Reprobus felt a surge of pity for the fragile creature. It seemed a simple task for a man who had once carried the shields of mighty, iron-clad warriors. He hoisted the child onto his broad, mountainous shoulders, feeling a weight no heavier than a handful of summer down. With a confident stride, the giant entered the water, his boots sinking into the shifting silt. As the current clawed at his knees with a cold, relentless ferocity. As they reached the center of the river, the atmosphere shifted, growing thick with a sudden, inexplicable gravity. The child upon his back began to grow heavy, as if the small limbs were drawing the very iron from the earth's core. Each step became a grueling battle against an impossible, crushing force. The waters rose to his waist, then his chest, the waves threatening to pull him into the dark, suffocating depths. Reprobus gasped for air, his muscles screaming under a burden that felt as though he were carrying the weight of 1,000 suns, and the grief of all humanity. "Who are you, little one?" the giant groaned, his knees buckling beneath the invisible mountain that pressed him toward the riverbed. He was a titan of legend, yet he was being broken by the weight of a single child. The water roared, but the child remained silent, heavy and profound. With a final agonizing surge of will, Reprobus lunged toward the far shore, collapsing onto the pebbles with his lungs burning like fire. He had survived the crossing, but the man who crawled from the water was no longer the seeker of earthly kings. A miracle had been etched into his very bone. The child stepped from the giant's shoulders, standing upon the wet stones with a grace that defied the laws of nature. The storm suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to vibrate. Reprobus looked up, his body trembling from the residual weight of the entire universe. "You have carried more than the world," the child spoke, his voice echoing with the authority of ancient thunders and celestial choirs. "You have carried the creator of the world upon your back." In that radiant moment, the giant realized he had finally found his eternal king. The boy commanded him to plant his staff into the dark, fertile earth as a sign of this divine encounter. To the giant's astonishment, the dead wood instantly sprouted green leaves and vibrant flowers, a living testament to the life-giving power of the sovereign he now served with joy. From that day, he was no longer Reprobus, the outcast, but Christopher, the Christ-bearer, a name that carried the fragrance of heaven. He left the riverbank behind, his heart a furnace of faith, traveling toward Lycia to bring the light of his king to the weary. As he preached in the crowded marketplaces, thousands were drawn to the spectacle of the flowering giant who spoke of a gentle God. His words were not academic, but burned with the raw conviction of a man who had felt the weight of the divine on his skin. However, the shadow of Rome was never far, and news of this miraculous titan soon reached the ears of the local prefect. To the Roman authorities, Christopher was not a saint, but a dangerous spark in a dry forest of rebellion, threatening their fragile, iron-fisted order. Spies and agitators began to circle him, whispering lies to the common folk and reporting his every miracle to the imperial seat. They saw in his gentleness a mockery of their strength, and in his devotion to Christ, a direct challenge to the emperor's divine and absolute claim. Christopher stood tall, his flowered staff a beacon of hope amidst a sea of rising hostility and growing Roman suspicion. The disciples gathered in his shadow, but the enemies were sharpening their blades, preparing a confrontation that would test the giant's faith unto the very point of death. The prefect Dagnus sat upon a throne of cold, unyielding marble, his eyes narrowed like a hunting hawk. He was a man bound by the rigid chains of Roman law, seeing the world only through the prism of order, taxes, and the emperor's divine, absolute, and unquestioned authority. To Dagnus, this towering Christ-bearer was not a holy man, but a chaotic anomaly that threatened to undo decades of imperial stability. He viewed Christopher's miracles as mere parlor tricks. Yet in the quiet of his chambers, he felt a nagging, hollow dread at the giant's growing influence. When Christopher was finally led into the sun-drenched atrium, the contrast was staggering to all who watched. The giant stood like a mountain of bronze, his head nearly touching the ornate ceiling, while the prefect seemed like a withered leaf before the sheer, overwhelming majesty of a forest. "Why do you forsake the gods of your fathers for a dead carpenter?" Dagnus demanded, his voice echoing with a forced and hollow bravado. He leaned forward, searching for a flicker of fear in the giant's eyes, but found only a tranquil, deep sea of unwavering and holy peace. Christopher did not shout. His voice was a low, resonant wave that filled the chamber with an ancient and undeniable truth. He spoke of a king whose kingdom was not built of stones, but of hearts, and whose power made the might of Rome look like scattering gray dust. The prefect's anger was a mask for his own mounting insecurity and the realization of his power's limits. He had executed thousands, yet he sensed that no blade could sever the connection between this titan and the invisible god he served with such a terrifying, silent, and resolute joy. Dagnus ordered the soldiers to bind the giant in chains of heavy iron, attempting to humiliate the man before the crowds. But as the metal clanked against his skin, Christopher stood unmoving, his spirit already soaring far above the reach of Roman shackles and petty mortal whims. The confrontation was no longer between a prisoner and a judge, but between two clashing worlds of power. Dagnus realized that fear was his only weapon. But was it for a man who had carried the King of Kings across the flood? Death was merely a final, glorious, and long-awaited crossing. The prefect, desperate to break the giant's spirit without shedding blood, devised a snare of flesh and gold. He sent two women of legendary beauty, Aquilina and Lycia, into the giant's cell. They were tasked to seduce him, to trade his heavenly devotion for the fleeting, earthly pleasures of the night. As the heavy iron door creaked shut, the air in the dungeon remained cool and scented with the fragrance of the flowering staff. The women approached with honeyed words, but Christopher looked upon them not with lust, but with a profound, soul-piercing compassion that silenced their practiced, seductive whispers. Instead of falling into their trap, the giant began to speak of the king who clothed the lilies of the field. His words were like a cleansing rain upon their parched hearts. By dawn, the tempters were transformed. They emerged from the cell as bold, vocal witnesses for the Christ. Enraged by this failure, Dagnus ordered a display of brutal, imperial force to crush the Titan's physical frame. A legion of archers was summoned to the courtyard, their bows drawn tight, forming a wall of tension. 1,000 arrows were aimed at the solitary, unmoving mountain that was Christopher. The command to fire shattered the silence, and a cloud of iron-tipped death hissed through the sunlit air. Yet, as the projectiles reached the giant, they seemed to strike an invisible, celestial shield. The arrows hung suspended in the atmosphere, as if time itself had frozen by a divine, sovereign decree. One stray arrow, fueled by a mysterious and unseen hand, suddenly veered from its path with a violent velocity. It struck the prefect Dagnus directly in the eye, plunging the tyrant into a world of physical darkness. The crowd gasped as the mighty ruler fell, blinded by his own cruel and stubborn pride. Christopher remained untouched, a silent sentinel of a kingdom that iron could not pierce. He looked upon the wounded prefect not with triumph, but with the same heavy, divine sorrow he had felt at the river. The miracle was not just in the protection, but in the unfolding judgment. The air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of ozone, and the realization that a higher law was in effect. The giant had withstood the fire and the arrow, proving that the king he carried was indeed the master of every element, every weapon, and every trembling mortal soul. The miracles had ceased, leaving behind the heavy, suffocating silence of the dungeon's damp stone walls. Christopher, the giant who had carried the world, now felt the crushing weight of his own mortal flesh. His massive limbs, once like rooted oaks, trembled with a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. The cold of the stone seeped into his scarred knees, and the darkness of the cell began to press against his spirit. He was a titan, yet he was also a man, vulnerable to the biting hunger and the agonizing thirst that clawed at his throat like a desert sun. In the quiet hours before dawn, shadows of doubt flickered like dying candles in his mind. He remembered the cool spray of the river and the simple life he had left behind. Was this lonely, iron-bound ending truly the destiny promised by the child on that stormy and fateful night? The pain from his old injuries, sustained during years of labor, and the recent Roman tortures, flared with a cruel intensity. He let out a low, guttural groan that echoed through the empty corridors, a sound that carried the raw, unvarnished truth of his profound and very human suffering. He looked at his massive hands, now bound and bruised, and felt the stinging tears of a weary traveler. This vulnerability did not diminish his holiness. Rather, it made his sacrifice a conscious choice of the will. He was a saint, not because he was painless, but because he endured. "My king," he whispered into the gloom, his voice cracking with the strain of 1,000 battles. "The burden of this flesh is heavy, and my soul longs for the rest of the eternal shores." He was an icon of strength, yet in this moment, he was a child. The memory of the Christ child's weight returned, not as a crushing force, but as a spiritual anchor for his fading resolve. He realized that his weakness was the canvas upon which the divine would paint its final, most beautiful victory. His frailty was the bridge to his coming glory. As the first light of his final day filtered through the high, barred window, Christopher stood up with a slow, agonizing grace. The man of iron was broken, but the man of faith was renewed. He accepted his humanity, knowing that the heaviest crossing was still yet to come. The final morning dawned with a pale, ghostly light that clung to the prison bars like a shroud. Christopher was led from the bowels of the earth, his massive frame casting a long, steady shadow over the weeping crowds. He moved with the dignity of a king approaching his coronation. Among the onlookers, his disciples stood with hearts heavy as lead, their eyes blurred by a sea of bitter tears. Christopher paused, his presence calming the rising tide of their collective grief. He did not offer words of vengeance, but a final, radiant blessing that smelled of spring and eternity. He turned his gaze toward the wounded Dagnes, who sat in a throne of darkness, his eye bandaged and his pride shattered. "When the blade falls," the giant whispered, "take my blood and mix it with the clay. Anoint your eyes, for the king desires your sight restored." This act of mercy struck the prefect harder than any physical blow ever could. How could a man offer healing to the very hand that signed his death warrant? Dagnes trembled, trapped between the rigid requirements of Roman law and the overwhelming, illogical power of a martyr's selfless, divine love. The giant then looked beyond the Roman soldiers, beyond the ancient walls, as if staring directly into the hearts of all who would hear his tale. His eyes seemed to pierce the veil of time, reaching out to the weary travelers of every age, seeking a spark of recognition. "You, who wander through the storms of your own lives," he seemed to ask, "what weight are you carrying across the rivers of your soul?" His silent question hung in the air, challenging every listener to consider if they too possessed the courage to carry the light in darkness. The path to the executioner's block was narrow, yet to Christopher, it was the widest road he had ever walked. He was leaving the world of shadows for the world of substance. Each step was a farewell to the dust and a greeting to the celestial, shimmering, eternal dawn. The farewell was complete. The giant had emptied himself of all earthly ties. He stood at the threshold of the great crossing, his heart beating with a steady, rhythmic peace. The world was behind him, the king was before him, and the final, glorious step was only moments away. The execution square was a theater of heavy silence, where the air felt thick with the scent of dry earth. An impending eternity? Christopher knelt upon the dust, his massive knees pressing into the ground that he had once shaken with his proud, youthful, and wandering footsteps. The executioner, a man of iron and shadow, stood behind the giant, his blade shimmering like a sliver of the cold moon. He hesitated, awed by the tranquility of the Titan who remained as still as a mountain. The giant's neck was a column of sun-bronzed, weathered resilience. Christopher closed his eyes, and the roar of the square faded into the familiar, rhythmic lapping of the river's dark waters. He felt the phantom weight of the child once more. But this time it was not a burden. It was a gentle, warm embrace of light. "Father, receive the bearer of thy son," he whispered, his voice a soft vibration that seemed to calm the very wind. He did not flinch as the steel was raised high. He was no longer a prisoner of Rome, but a citizen of a kingdom beyond the stars. The blade fell with a swift, decisive finality, severing the silver cord of his earthly pilgrimage. In that shattering moment, a sudden, brilliant flash of light was seen by the faithful, as if the heavens had torn open to welcome a hero back to his true and eternal home. His blood spilled upon the thirsty soil, a crimson testament to a love that outweighed the world and all its kingdoms. The giant's body collapsed with a heavy, hollow thud. Yet the atmosphere did not feel empty. It was filled with a triumphant, vibrating, and holy presence. The soldiers stood frozen, their spears lowering as they witnessed a peace that their iron discipline could never achieve. The earth beneath the block seemed to sigh, as if relieved of a great weight, while the sky above Lycia turned a deep, royal, and majestic purple. Christopher had completed his final crossing, leaving behind the mud of the riverbank for the crystalline shores of the New Jerusalem. The giant was dead. Yet in the hearts of the trembling witnesses, the Christ-bearer had never been more alive, more powerful, or more eternally and beautifully free. In the wake of the execution, a heavy, transformative grace descended upon the city of Lycia. The prefect Dagnus, trembling in his world of shadows, reached out for the earth soaked in the giant's blood. He mixed the sacred clay, applying it to his blinded and weeping eyes. As the mixture touched his skin, the darkness shattered like a fallen mirror. Dagnus gasped, his sight restored not just to the physical world, but to the spiritual truth he had long persecuted. He fell to his knees, weeping for the king that Christopher had served so faithfully. The legend of the Christ-bearer began to flow like a mighty river, crossing the borders of empires and the vastness of centuries. Monasteries rose in his name, and his image was etched into the stone of every cathedral, a silent sentinel guarding the weary travelers of the world. Throughout the Middle Ages, sailors and pilgrims looked to the stars, whispering the name of Christopher to calm the rising storms. He became the patron of the road, the holy protector of those who venture into the unknown, carrying his strength as a shield against the dark. His miracles continued long after his bones had turned to sacred dust. Those suffering from epilepsy and the bite of toothache found solace in his intercession. To the broken and the burdened, Christopher remained the giant who proved that no weight is too heavy when carried for Christ. Even today, in an age of steel and lightning-fast transit, his medal hangs from 1,000 mirrors and archers, a quiet reminder of a timeless journey. He is the companion of the bachelor and the guardian of the child, a bridge between the ancient world and our own modern wanderings. The story of the giant is not a mere relic of the past, but a living flame for the soul. It reminds us that our greatest strength is found in our willingness to serve the smallest among us. For in doing so, we carry the very King of all creation. As you walk the uncertain paths of your own life, remember the Titan of the river. The crossing may be treacherous and the burden heavy, but you do not walk alone. Like Christopher, may you find the courage to carry the light until you reach the eternal shore.